success for me is about 20%, 30% tops. They're training these things and giving it their username and password. That credential is compromised. Right?
When I see it, I want to close my eyes, and
9 out of 10 users, they use at least either the same username and or derivative of the same password for every application. And agents are meant to learn patterns and everything else. You do that across a couple of applications, that agent's going to start saying, well, I know the format they're doing this. I'm just going to go start guessing these things. Honestly, that's what keeps me up at night.
And actually, like right now, I should just be taking off my Zero Trust t-shirt.
The 80-to-1 stat is actually pretty interesting because I think that's a bit low. The NHI management group estimating about a 400-to-1 at this point, and this is only getting faster. I was trying to dig the ocean out with a spoon, so to speak, right? The business was moving faster than I could keep my arms around it, and I got burnt out. One thing clicked in my head: I need to focus on the service of security and identity, not so much controlling identity and security. All the AI features that are going into identity governance platforms right now, around the role recommenders, the automated approvals, dynamic certifications, attestations, everything else. What are they making those decisions on today if they only have 20% of the visibility?
Zero Trust Podcast is a show at the intersection of cybersecurity, business, and AI. Hosted by experts in the field, Art and Oli, the podcast unpacks the latest threats, trends, and innovations shaping the digital security. Zero Trust Podcast brings raw insights, expert interviews, and thought-provoking discussions to help businesses and individuals navigate an increasingly hostile cyber world. Whether you're a security professional, tech, or business leader, this is your go-to source for unfiltered cybersecurity intelligence. And remember, never trust, always verify.
Hello and welcome to another episode of your favorite podcast by Zero Trust Media. Today we have very special guests. Art, would you introduce?
Yeah, absolutely. Today we joined by Nick Hunt, CEO of StackBob.ai. Nick has spent roughly 25 years in cybersecurity and more than 20 years specifically in identity security. And Nick led multi-year, multi-million-dollar identity governance programs across healthcare and financial sector, right? And managed IAM across various vendors, Oracle, across major US institutions, and built and led team of 100 plus identity engineers, right? So it sounds really amazing. Welcome, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's nice to meet you, Artem. Ole, always a pleasure talking.
Cool.
Let's start with a simple question. Nick, why should businesses care about identity governance at all?
Identity governance is one of those things that everyone understands they need from a compliance aspect, but really don't understand the true impotence or importance behind it. The easy answer, and the way I like to describe it, is identity governance is the coordinator. It's the traffic cop. It's Newton's third law. Every input and output of your organization is identity governance. Someone gets hired, what do they need access to? Go execute on that, right? I think everyone looks at the authentication, the MFA, the visible, the user experience pieces of identity and access management. Identity governance is that program, that foundational coordination layer for your identity program. And that's why organizations really need to look at it and focus a lot of attention on it.
Okay, but why? I'm sorry if the question would sound stupid, but I just want to figure out. Most of the companies have either Google Workspace or Microsoft Active Directory. It could be placed in Azure, it could be local, whatever. Why we can't just connect all tools and manage identities through the centralized Active Directory? Why the IGA market as it exists?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's really a couple of things I look at, right? From a Google Workspace, from an Entra, everything else, they are central repositories, right? They handle authentication, they enforce policy, everything else. But at the end of the day, applications need to get that data so they can define local entitlements, local user profiles, preferences, fine-grained permissions, everything else. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is in that local definition of users, not every application is going to conform to, say, a group claim in an OAuth spec or a group assertion, from an attribute flow and everything else, right? So while they may get some of that data, to define loose permission sets and everything else. Those fine-grained permissions and or anything that's not a part of the core identity spec still needs to be defined in that local application. So yeah, you may be able to delegate authentication to a Google Workspace or to an Entra or something along those lines, but that identity governance is going to define that identity metadata down to those applications. The main counter to that, you could say, well, we do just-in-time provisioning. Okay, well, are you going to handle every user attribute and are you going to maintain every preference about that user in a central application, right? That would be one aspect of it. The other aspect is all the identity data going to be available and what are you going to pass around to all the different applications? So identity governance is that foundational glue, let's call it, between all the individual applications. The Google Workspaces, the Entras, everything else are what are asserting this is Nick authenticating, map him to the local profile that you have in your system.
Okay, cool. I like it. We have a new tradition, in fact. We try most of our podcasts to do locally, offline, together with people in the same room. And we're experimenting with this new type of podcast. And we have a new tradition to welcome a guest because we can't shake hands physically. We propose to have high fives with both hands all together. Let's do that. Boom.
Sure.
Yay. So let's start. Guys, let's kick off with the technical part, right? Let's figure out what is good with the industry and what is broken in the industry of identity management. So I'm also 20 years in cybersecurity, and I remember the times when it was quite simple to manage identities. To be honest, you didn't have lots of agentic stuff, lots of AI, non-human identities. The perimeter was closed. You didn't have clouds, SaaS, and all this stuff, and it was kind of the local environment with closed perimeter, firewalls, IPSs, VPNs. Active Directory, and that's it, right? But we live in completely different era right now. So, Nick, in your opinion, what is the biggest identity challenge for identity security today?
I'd say the biggest challenge for me is the pace of business when it comes to identity management and cybersecurity in general, honestly, right? You look at the pace of new standards coming out right now, new applications that are hitting the market. We've got this rapid rise of micro applications, so to speak. Very small app fixing a very defined problem versus these bigger kind of monolithic platforms. I came up like you where we had these big ERPs, these big enterprise platforms, which we still do today, right? The Oracles, the SAPs, all backed by your Oracle database and an Active Directory and stuff like that. Very small, very big problem at the end of the day. But now, with coding becoming much easier, so to speak, right? This vibe coding or micro application or de-technification, if I want to, make up a term of application development, right? We're getting very, very wide from an application perspective. But at the same time, the standards haven't been defined or aren't pervasive, so to speak. So if you look at things like OAuth, SAML, SCIM, just basic REST-based services, a lot of the micro apps that are coming up right now aren't conforming to those standards, right? Because they're serving a very myopic purpose. Like, hey, I want to be able to run a report or analyze this type of data or serve this particular vertical and problem, right? You can spin up apps very, very quickly, take them to market. As soon as people start buying them, then we need enterprise management capability. So from an identity and security perspective, we're kind of fighting a much, much more rapidly evolving problem, so to speak. When everything was controlled inside of our four walls, so to speak, to request a server, it had to go through a governance process, right? And that governance process would say, well, is it patched? What kind of server is it? What kind of database do you need? Does it subscribe to our LDAP? Can we authenticate it? Or do we need to do MFA? What kind of data is in it? Everything else. If someone can go out and buy an application or they can subscribe on their phone, kind of worst case, let's start talking, you start giving enterprise data to that thing. And all of a sudden now it's actually doing something for the business and it needs to be controlled. It doesn't have the same due diligence as we used to be able to do. Right? So it's a problem with, kind of this rapid evolution. The other problem I would say is the speed at which security and identity respond to these requests. Like all things being equal, someone goes through the process, they go through the application governance, the general onboarding, everything else. The tools and amount of resources dedicated based on how they're structured may not respond as quickly as the business needs to move. So if they go through the process, but it's going to be a 3-month due diligence process, but they need it today, that's a lot of people try to go around, I don't want to say skirt the process, but at the end of the day, say, well, if I need it and I've got my own credit card and it's fairly cheap, I can do it under an approval. I'm just going to go out and buy it type thing. So I think as an industry, security and identity need to be responsive to more of a service-driven architecture so that people can subscribe, they can integrate, based on a set of standards and everything else. It's not a big review process.
And I'm just you're talking about all these points about all these technologies which are already in place, like SAML, SCIM, all those APIs, SSOs, and there are lots of usual suspect vendors who traditionally help to govern the identity question, like Okta, like Microsoft SailPoint or open source Midpoint, you name it. And I'm wondering, it's been 20 years of this industry being developed, and it looks like, all the necessary technologies are in place, but still in most projects, in my experience and practical experience, the majority of apps, or at least the big portion of apps, and by the way, it would be interesting to hear your statistics, are not really connected, managed, or governed, right? So why, after 20 years of this industry being developed, we're still talking about the same AIM problems, basically?
I break down IAM into like 3 main buckets at the end of the day. I think there's different maturity levels when you start looking at it. So we've got access management, which is authentication standards. That's going to be your SAML OAuth. Unfortunately, LDAP and database are still in that equation, but let's primarily focus on the main standards, the SAML and OAuth, right? You've got the identity governance problem, which is defining permissions, coordination, common standards around username format so that the access management can actually do what it needs to do, right? And then the bigger bucket, which is gaining a lot of attention right now, is going to be the privilege management. So the non-human identities, the default credentials, the super secure, deity accounts, right? The super user accounts and everything else. From an overall maturity perspective, I'd say the access management is probably the more mature of this bucket. I came up in the Liberty Alliance, the SAML wars, the WS Trust wars, right? And we kind of had this, late 90s, early 2000s, where it's like, well, which direction are we going to go? Are we going to go Liberty? We're going to go SAML, or we're going to go WS Trust, right? SAML ended up winning it at the end of the day, and kind of everyone coalesced. OAuth came about later, right? Identity governance, on the other hand, never had that moment of, hey, we've got multiple protocols that could win, so to speak, right? And something bubbled up. SCIM was defined, I want to say, in the late 90s, but really only defines 2 things. It only defines users and groups. But the modern application is going to be users, groups, default credentials, personal access tokens, preferences, right? There's a lot of things that go into defining who a person is, or more importantly, who a non-human is and what they can do in an application that SCIM just can't do, right? So I think some people have adopted SCIM, but then they have add-ons, or they have their own generic REST capabilities that defines everything, but that still requires a connector, right? And what we run into a lot when it comes to identity governance is, they may have a generic REST interface, but then the permissions, the groups, how you define what that person or non-person can do in the target application isn't linked to the API. So you've got these secondary processes. So yes, it's mature, we've got a spec, but at the same time, there's no conformity. There's no standard that says, hey, if you're going to define a person or permission or fine-grained permissions and all these other things, here's what you need to do. Now, I think industry is responding right now with this, and we've had these standards around. You look at things like OPA, OPA Rego as kind of the same thing in Styrie. You look at OpenFGA. You look at some of the other authorization languages that are coming about right now. Those are starting to address this problem. But at the end of the day, how do you map those, or how do you integrate those into target applications that have 40 years of history built into how they define permissions, right? Privilege, being a hybrid of both of those, essentially takes components from each, but at the end of the day, if you look at a lot of applications, they may have a user repository, but then they have a super user repository. So now you've got this whole separate process just to manage super users. Privilege is very, very focused right now, or PAM in general, about going to those individual applications for a very myopic use case. Like, hey, show me privileged user accounts and manage those. Yeah, it's the same thing or same idea as general identity governance, but at the end of the day, it's very, very focused on one thing.
And can you share with us what is the size of the problem in the industry right now?
So I've been doing this for about 20 years, from an identity governance perspective, general AM. I'd say most environments and most people I talk to on the access management side are probably in the area of 60, 70% coverage, right? There's still a lot of applications that still use usernames and passwords. They've got a different username format, right? They're micro apps. They don't support whatever it is type of thing, right? So 60, 70%, enterprise SSO or enterprise authentication, let's put it that way, right? Identity governance, on the other hand, you've got a population of 100 applications, 70 of them subscribe to your SSO and MFA. You go over to the identity governance of actually managing identity data across those applications. Success for me is about 20%, 30% tops, right? If you can manage 30% of your users via your identity governance, that's good, right? Now,
that's a current situation, right? It's not good,
current situation,
but it's what it is right now.
It's better than nothing.
So you say that 70% of apps are not really managed by the enterprise users, right?
Yeah,
Amazing.
So 70% when it comes to identity governance is about typical, right? Now, what we've done over the years to address this problem, right? Because you've got these compliance overlays and regulations and everything else. So you've got 20, 30% that are covered by identity governance, have that rich experience. You could do certification attestations, near real-time updates, the permissions they have, everything else, right? That next population, let's say it's another 20% or so of the applications to take you to 40%. They're still in scope for compliance, but you don't have a connector or a way to manage those users. What we've done over the years is say, okay, well, we're going to own it from a business policy perspective in the identity governance, but we're going to hand it off to a ServiceNow or some other ticketing system to essentially have someone go on and execute on this. So policy is still defined. Hey, this is in scope. We need to be able to review the users. They have to go through a governance process to get access, but we're going to give it to a person to go fulfill it. And this is a challenge in a number of ways. If you think about it, is you've invested in this big identity governance platform, right? This is going to automate all my identity stuff. But instantly right there, you're pulling out of that justification to say, well, we're only going to do it for this much and we're going to hand it off to a person. And a person, they may be busy. The data that hits the queue may have an extra space in it, whatever it may be. So what could happen and happens far too often is they copy and paste out of tickets, which you get, extra characters, there may be bad data, or maybe the identity governance doesn't have the right, entitlement I need at that point in time. So I got a ticket to an owner, they go provision that access, it's not the right access, and, I go to try to do it, and it's like, hey, Ole, I needed something additional. And I know you closed the ticket because I can see the history, and I just request it. So now we've got a diff from what identity governance assume I have to what was actually added to that target application. Humans are subjective at the end of the day, and that subjectivity makes it into that manual fulfillment. The other challenge
is... honestly sounds crazy, like people still manually, onboard people by copy-pasting from some Excel table. It sounds like, from the Stone Age.
Well, it's actually really funny when you think about it. Like, you build an identity governance platform, it handles everything it can do from a connector perspective. But then you're building these additional kind of manual capabilities to support the identity governance capability to say, okay, yes, it is managing our policy and the general data flow, but we still need more teams of people to essentially fulfill what the identity governance is saying to do, right? So while you're building this automation platform, you're still building manual fulfillment teams to support that, so to speak. And I'd say the two big sectors I find this is the biggest challenge, is probably going to be healthcare and financial services. These are older industries that are still running mainframes, still running very large kind of monolithic applications when you think about EMR platforms, right? They're very, very big, very, very complicated. So they have whole secondary teams, call it epic security teams in healthcare, right? Or, mainframe teams that are taking all these manual requests out of identity governance and fulfilling them in those legacy platforms.
So let's summarize. In your experience, Nick, you're saying that around 20% of apps are connected to IGA platform, and other 20% are not connected in automated way, but are managed through ticketing systems and reconciled in like some regular period of times. And then another 60% are typically disconnected, not governed, and just managed by local teams, local owners, and completely unknown, and basically are the shadow IT.
I think they're known to the organization, right? And they're in a backlog somewhere. But at the end of the day, they're not managed by a central identity process. It's still a lot of tribal knowledge, manual tickets, like, hey, I know the manager of that group, I'm just going to request it type thing.
So essentially, for the business audience who might be watching us right now, if we try to simplify all these fancy abbreviations which we use and the complexities, so we have the authentication problem, right? This is number one, which is not so obvious and not so, let's say, bold problem compared to the second one, which is authorization, when we essentially give permissions to the certain users to do something in the particular app, right? So if the first one...
probably provisioning, I guess, because authorization, it's more customer identity and access management, right? So you need SAP application.
No, it's not only. Authorization is authorization. You authorize somebody to do something. Authentication, you check if it is the person who states it is, right?
Right, but you can have authorization inside the app, right? When the person is doing the login, and then you do the authentication, and then the application authorizes user to do something. Based on his role and permissions, right? And then there is another problem, or maybe I'm wrong, when you are doing the provisioning or identity governance. Identity governance is not authorization, is it?
This is in fact a very good point. What is provisioning, right, in this process? And this one I would be happy, Nick, to address. How you could explain to a 3-year-old kid what is provisioning after the authentication?
Well, provisioning after authentication, or just provisioning in general, is going to be data synchronization at the end of the day, right? Okay. So I've got two systems. One is the authority, let's call it, so to speak, right? This is the authority for everything in general. The second is going to be a target, right? And I need to move data between the two based on a certain set of criteria, is where governance comes into play. But identity provisioning at the end of the day is just going to be synchronization, right? Nick is an employee. He needs to have an account in that target application. I need to move his data over there, which is kind of an interesting thing because the original foundations of identity governance were called identity sync, right? So I came through the MIS days and the old Novell, days where everything was identity provisioning as a technology or identity synchronization, right? Identity governance came about when you started having that business policy layer on top of it.
Reviews and other stuff, right?
Yep. Certification, attestation, join remover levers, all the other stuff from a Sarbanes-Oxley compliance HIPAA perspective. General lifecycle management, if you want to call it that.
And then authorization. How would you explain authorization?
Authorization is a funny concept. I'd say about 10, 15 years ago, identity governance was your authorization platform, right? Because it was the business policy layer at the end of the day. So based on me being an employee, me having a certain department, I get provisioned to a target application and I get a certain set of roles, right? I'm authorized to do something. Authentication asserts who I am. Identity governance basically seeds my data and authorizes me to do something. And I think that was true up until, essentially the agentic revolution we're talking about right now, or the last 5 years or so, right? Oh, yeah. Authorization now is not only, am I a member of a proper group, but what about the context of how I'm accessing that application, right? Am I coming from a managed device? What's my identity security posture look like? Have I MFA'd recently? Am I coming from an approved geolocation? There's other stuff that's going into that authorization question right now beyond just who I am. So authorization is shifting very quickly to not only be, do I have the right group membership, but am I also meeting organizational policy at the same time? So identity governance isn't handling some of those conversations right now. It's just handling the management of my data to enable me. But in that context, I still may not be authorized.
Okay. And so if the key, sorry, please go on.
Oh, no, I was going to say, you look at some of the adaptive MFA and adaptive authorization or continuous signaling controls and everything else going on right now, right? That's where that context is starting to come into play.
I'm just keep thinking about this 70% of gap, and I can't imagine how it is possible. I mean, what the options we have, right? What's wrong with API scheme? And Samuel, you already addressed a little bit on this topic, but let's slightly dive deeper into that and what actually StackBob offers, because you're a new kid on the block, so to say, and it looks like you're tapping into a large, complex, slow market with a very innovative approach. So it's interesting to grasp and understand what particular problem you help to solve.
Go through a typical identity governance deployment, right, from a program implementation perspective. And everyone I talked to when I was consulting and just general advisory, I always said, this is what you need to expect when you're doing identity governance deployment. And the way I look at it is I look at three things. So you're going to have a target application ecosystem. Let's say it's 100, kind of keeping an easy number. So of that 100, let's say 20 of them have an out-of-the-box connector from whatever identity governance platform you're going with. SailPoint, Savient. Yeah, it could be SCIM, it could be ICF, it could be a number of things. But at the end of the day, there's an out-of-the-box named connector for that application. 20 of them are going to be easy, so to speak, right? It's pretty point click. You figure you need to manage data and a bunch of other things around the governance. But at the end of the day, there's something out of the box, right?
And you also need to upgrade your subscription typically to the most expensive enterprise plans in order to activate them, right? So it's not available to everyone right from the box, but you could buy it, and money can buy this.
Potentially, yeah. There, you look at LDAP, some of the bigger, the SAPs, the Oracles, everything else that are full ICF connectors, right? There's a number of them that, let's just say 20 of them out of the box, you can get done. The far right end of the spectrum, these are the ones I always say are cost prohibitive. You're never going to get them done, no matter how much money you're going to spend. I come from a healthcare background. You look at a lot of the imaging or homegrown applications, everything else, they're still on Windows NT and Windows XP boxes to this day, right? No matter what you do, you're not going to write a connector for that platform. So you've got one that's easy, one you're never going to get done. So all of those, day one, you're going to put into your year one plan for your identity governance install. The ones you're never going to get done, you're going to put into a ServiceNow queue because it's just cost prohibitive to do it. Let's put it that way. The 20 you're going to get done through your implementation. But then you've got this big middle bucket of they either have an API, you may have to pay for it. But at the end of the day, you need to either write a generic scripted connector, whether it's via database REST, or there's other mechanisms you can get into it, right? So that's usually the biggest bucket of it. Consider that out of 100, maybe 60 applications, 50 applications. That's where the breakdown identity governance installs starts happening. Is you have a plan like, hey, we're going to do these 50 applications, but you get into year one, year two, other priorities start picking up, or it's just not a priority. It's too difficult. The API doesn't behave exactly like you need, and kind of priorities just start dropping down, right? The other thing to think about is to even write those connectors in the middle. As an industry, we've done very good the last 20 years to make it easier and easier. But best case scenario, you're still looking at about a 2 to 3 week development cycle to write a generic scripted connector, get it pushed into your identity governance, manipulate the data, clean everything up, everything else. And at 50 applications, that's a year and a half of development work, roughly.
At least, I would say.
At least. So now you've got a year and a half backlog and other priorities just to get all this data into your identity governance program. And usually at some point, there's a decision, usually around year one and a half, to say, hey, we've got what's good enough today, right? Everything else we're just going to kind of deal with, right? We've got other priorities and everything else. The Agentic IGA revolution that we're sitting in and what StackBob is essentially providing addresses that middle bucket, right? This is where we focus on. So rather than that 2 to 3 week development cycle, our agents can naturally go out and learn those target applications, aggregate that data, and we can use an out-of-the-box connector for the identity governance platform. So if you think about it, that initial 20 that were out of the box based on the connectors in that platform, instead of just being 20, I have the 20 plus the 50 agentic sitting in the middle in year one that you can implement. The far right side of that spectrum, the ones that are so cost prohibitive, are running on that Windows NT box, those are still going to be there, just like they are today, right? That's a near
I hope
impossible ask.
someday it will end up in the graveyard. I hope, but definitely not today. It's not a very rapid process of getting rid of very old nested technologies.
I think there's always going to be that component. I was just told by a friend about a year ago, something I built in, I want to say 2004, right, was running on an old server 2003 JBoss cluster, right? It literally just got upgraded to the latest and greatest a year ago. That's what, 16, 20 years roughly. No longer supported. It's on server 2003, right? It's on an old JBoss, everything else. It was still running in the corner and doing exactly what it needed. Right? It's one of those things that we're always going to have that bucket.
But on the other hand, we have all these wipe coding tools, which are essentially getting better and better with each day. I'm not I do not program in practice for a very long time, but recently, together with the Cloud Code, I wrote the native desktop application for macOS because I needed to, one thing to be done, and I couldn't find this plugin. So in 20 minutes, I did it with Claude, then 10 minutes for testing, and it's ready, right? So now I think this, traditional issue of we don't have some experts left who knows how to use Fortran, how to run programs or Fortran or update, or something else very old like Fortran. And it always was a ticking bomb issue, right? That we would reach some day when nobody would know how to operate it. And now it looks like there is a solution for this issue, right? So why can't we apply the same approach and basically write connector for everything using the same tools? What is your call on that?
You can to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, let's use that Fortran application or the one that I wrote, from 2004, so to speak. Security is going to come over top and say, hey, this can't be connected to our network because of X, Y, and Z. We need to microsegment lock this thing away. It's critical to our business, so we can't delete it, so to speak, right? So it still needs to be here, but at the end of the day, it can't subscribe to any of our normal enterprise services. So it may still run in a corner and it still functions exactly like it needs to do, but connectivity to it is just prohibitive. Now, it may get rewritten using vibe coding, but as soon as it gets rewritten using vibe coding, unless you've got those instructions in the rewrite to say, hey, yes, rewrite this functionality on a modern platform. And also make sure it uses an OAuth delegation from an authentication perspective. It has these claims built into it. It subscribes to the authorization spec so it can get central authorization. Like all these things you need to build into that instruction set. Unless you tell it, right, it's not going to make it there. So now you're going to rewrite it and it's going to be sitting in a corner. Now at least you have connectivity and StackBob can come into play and essentially automate the user management on top of it. But for something that's still sitting in a corner and functioning, security teams are getting very good about saying, hey, this can't connect to our network, or we're going to isolate this thing so much that it's not functional beyond what it executes. And I think that's needed, right?
Absolutely.
If they're not getting patched, they don't have proper controls, everything else, run a zero trust call, that thing can't be trusted other than to execute the one task it does.
Absolutely. So if we try to again emphasize in the most plain English, what is the agentic identity governance? I would stop myself at this point. I would just leave it to you.
Yeah, the way I like to describe it is essentially it's building automated connectors based on agentic technology, right? So it's learning target application functionality at the end of the day, right? That's the big thing, is rather than writing connectors which are structured around available APIs, essentially using agentic technology to learn application functionality around user management. So create, reads, updates, deletes, group management, right? And essentially leverage that learning pattern to execute those user management tasks, and doing it in a way that we're not trying to replace the existing identity governance market, right? We're trying to augment and enhance it to essentially accelerate it, right? Because identity governance today is doing very, very good at the data it can see. You look at some of the tools and capabilities out there, it's ridiculously cool, right? I mean, it's worlds different from when I was originally doing this, but their major gap is they don't. Yeah, SailPoint, Savient. I'm talking to a few friends at Conductor One right now. You look at some of the AI-based ones that are taking out user friction from an identity governance perspective, like the Lumoses of the world and everything else, right? They're focused on that end user functionality from a business policy perspective, but they all still rely on data, connectivity to those target applications. So StackBob is essentially coming in and saying, hey, you focus on what you're doing very well. We're going to provide that connectivity layer so that you have full control, or at least full visibility into all those target applications.
So here, basically, we're coming back to this 20% connected apps that are connected through existing IGAs, and then the rest, like 80%, which are not connected. This is the part that StackBob is covering.
I'm focused on that 80% population, right? Making sure that the 20% is now 90% from an identity governance perspective. And they have that data, right? They can start making informed decisions. The big risk I see right now with that 20% is everyone's going into the AI era right now. Let's put it that way, right? Every tool has AI built into it, whether it's decisions, whether it's data analysis and recommendations, or it's connectivity in StackBob's case, right? Everyone's got some component of AI built in. If you look at the major IGA platforms right now, they're heavily investing in AI.
What makes this approach scalable and not fragile at the same time? How you approach it? Yeah.
So let's kind of go through a couple of ways we tried to fix this over the years, and that'll kind of answer your question of why this is more resilient and not so fragile, so to speak, right? I think we've had a couple of attempts over the years of how to fix this. One is the manual fulfillment aspect, right? That was an option, and I think a lot of people centered on it just because it was quick and easy, right? And it achieved the goal. There's been two other major kind of focuses over the years. One was more, I call them protocol proxies at the end of the day, right? So SCIM is universal. Does it cover every use case? No, but at the end of the day, every IGA platform talks SCIM. So you've got this market of protocol proxies that will take a SCIM request and essentially translate them into a target protocol, whether that's database, whether that's REST, whether that's flat file, right? You look at things like MuleSoft, WSO2 with their middleware, a couple other vendors in the market that have these big API gateways and middleware platforms. People were building these protocol proxies on those to essentially translate and provide interfaces. Now that works because it provides a SCIM interface, but at the end of the day, you still have a development cycle to essentially handle every application that you need to connect to that, and it's not universal. It's still an inventory problem. Okay, I've got 50 applications. I still need to write 50 protocol translations in my middleware, so to speak.
Yeah.
The next move was RPA. So the robotic process automation. Robotic process automation bots at the end of the day, click automation. So
UI-based browser automation.
Yeah, UI-based browser automations at the end of the day, right?
Okay.
UiPath, Blue Prism, providers of the like. That worked to a certain degree.
But it sounds very clumsy.
It is, right? I don't want to say it's clumsy, right? You can definitely train a bot on how to click stuff, right? But the challenge we ran into is as soon as applications started moving things, speed wasn't the same. The application was down. How resilient are they to retries, to change, to other factors in those target applications that would essentially cause them to break, right? And the other thing that it doesn't handle bi-directional connectivity. Yeah, RPA can take a task and go close it, like move data around and everything else. But how is it going to aggregate all the target data that an identity governance needs so it can make decisions of, yes, I sent you a request, yes, it was fulfilled, and two, some additional access was granted outside of my control, right? This trust but verify concept. It's good for one way, but it's not resilient to change, and you kind of run into other issues.
Yeah, and one might say that, hey, user management controls are not changing that much. But in reality, like, because this is UI based automation, like if you do some marketing tags insertion or some like slide up changes in your website somewhere else, it just influences the whole DOM structure, and it's like breaks. And we actually experimented with that like a few years ago as like trying to do RPA 2.0. And actually, like right now, I should just be taking off my Zero Trust t-shirt. And yeah, so we tried to do this about 3 or 4 years ago when we started basically building RPA 2.0 as a first version of StackBob, doing traditional UI-based automations, and then apply AI on top of it. But in the reality, it was just like so fragile, so unperformant, so it was very slow. And we were facing so many issues that it, even with AI, like doing RPA, next gen RPA wasn't the way to go. And then later on we switched to the other agentic approach, which is right now actually it's a hybrid automations, as we call them. So we have a traditional agentic automations, which are non-deterministic agents doing some non-sensitive steps. So for example, if we need to do a login into the app or detect some elements, like we can use traditional non-deterministic agents. But as soon as we get into sensitive steps, so for example, we need to provision user with specific level of access, or find and deprovision user, delete the user, right? Then this is a sensitive part, and we believe this should be done deterministically. So we created a pipeline of models which create so deterministic scripts that we can run in the browser and execute this safely, performantly, and reliably.
From an RPA perspective, we've done it. It works, right? It's just not. It's very locally managed. It's not kind of industry wide and everything else. And what you end up running into is you spinning up secondary teams to essentially manage the maintenance of the bots and updates and everything else, right? So you kind of get this initial win, but then it kind of levels off and it starts coming back down when maintenance starts coming in. And you need to build all those reconciliation processes. You still have to deal with flat files and other data connectivity issues and everything else, right? So now fast forward to the Agentic IGA, so to speak, right? It really looks at all those problems we've done over the years. So we've got the protocol proxy, we've got the UI-based automations, you've got the aggregation, everything. It's pulling all that stuff together with resilience, with performance, everything else in place, right? As Ole mentioned, we've got the learning model that will learn application functionality and kick out those deterministic scripts, right? And then we execute on those, but it's not executing a task. It's executing a process, if I want to say it that way, right? Not only pushing users, but getting so the identity governance has its complete picture.
The more you speak about all these issues, it more sounds for me that you do not directly compete with, traditional players like Okta, SailPoint, Microsoft, or do you?
No, we're an enhancement. We're an add-on, is what I like to say. Going back to the identity governance deployment cycle, right? That year one is going to be that platform, right? That is your core business logic, policy, your segregation of duties, certification attestations, your joiner, mover, leaver processes, your role metadata, everything else, right? That year one plus of where you start gaining your momentum and you need to connect to your target environment, that's where StackBob steps in and says, you know what? We're going to provide those interfaces to all those things so you can do this essentially year one plus 1 month, essentially, right? Like we'll provide everything. We'll provide very rich data so you can focus on enhancing that data, right?
Okay. Cool.
So that's our focus.
Yeah, I'll just this week we are going to get to this as well. But I think like Anna, our brand manager, will be very unhappy if she will hear that we are add-on, because we are not add-on. We are integration or infrastructure layer and connectivity layer, an essential part of the on the journey to 100% coverage in your IGA deployments.
But the point is that you elegantly fit into this, extensive clause to grab extra apps, which you can't do without you guys, actually, right? So in this sense, it really sounds as a add-on, but it's how you could name it add-on if you cover kind of 70%, which is not covered by the original app, right? So yeah, interesting. But we mentioned earlier the shadow IT question and the 70%. I mentioned it again. But when it comes to internal agentic AI thing, I think we have 100% of shadow AI in terms of identities, right? And I just, when we were preparing to this episode, I ran into statistics from CyberArk. They say, by the way, we need to tap into the PAM question as well. So CyberArk says that there is 80-to-1 ratio between non-human identities and human identities, essentially. So what is your call on that? How StackBob could help with managing the AI identities?
So the 80-to-1 stat is actually pretty interesting, because I think that's a bit low. I've seen it, if you look at the NHI management group, they're estimating about a 400-to-1 at this point.
Ooh.
In the latest stats. And this is only getting faster. But to answer the question directly, how we're managing those AI agents, right, so to speak, I see the AI agent problem going two directions right now. And it's not a problem. I shouldn't put it that way. You've got traditional principle-based provisioning, right, which I've got an agent, it needs to execute in a target application, I need to provision it. So StackBob, with our connectivity on top of an existing identity governance process or a privilege access management process, if you want to start thinking about it, if we're talking about CyberArk, right, it still needs to be able to connect and provision a principal to that target application, right? So StackBob can extend the existing IGA to facilitate that provisioning, right? So that those upstream processes based on the agent registration can happen like they normally would, and the proper permissions are applied and everything else, right? Now that's kind of the standing privilege approach I see the AI agent provisioning going right now. The second is going to be more the policy-based provisioning. So if you look at standards like SPIFFE and SPIFFE and the Spire operators and the like, right, that are more policy-driven, those are going to be outside of a normal identity governance provisioning process, right? They're going to be more of an access management at some point. So it wouldn't be a part of StackBob, but saying that, you're still going to need to define those permissions and possibly a general policy concept from a principal perspective in different applications, right? So we're going back to that connectivity problem, the visibility, everything else, right? If you've got a general category of agents or technology that need a named authorization or a named principal in the target application, you need connectivity to it. And that's where StackBob comes in and can essentially go out and handle that workload of doing that provisioning.
So basically, to StackBob, all identities are equal. Yeah. Right? StackBob doesn't care if it's a human.
Democracy.
Yeah.
It sounds like a real democracy.
The interesting thing about the democracy or equal concept, right, is since the NHI stuff and agents have grown the last 2 years, you've really saw a breakdown in the concept of naming it as users, right? A lot of the marketing has shifted to either identities or principals, because you can't say anymore, hey, this is a user, because it may not be a user. Now it's a principal. It's an identity concept. And everyone's focusing on more the human, non-human aspect of it. So we've really kind of generalized that name, so to speak.
Yeah. It's just, I'm seeing it more and more with the customers whom we serve and help as MSP, as virtual CISO provider. The maturity of this agentic approaches is really getting better and better every week. and there are already kind of frameworks which have multiple layers, like the governance AI agent layer, where you have PM agent, governance monitoring agent, then you have these sub agents which actually execute and do stuff, and then you have the QA agents who check how the previous layers worked out, and only then you have human in the loop who checks everything, right? And when you think about this from this perspective, like you started to actually break into multiple agents, the same thing which we used to do with one agent a year ago. It was far less capable, and now it's a tremendous increase in the reasonability and capabilities of these agents, and it really makes sense to do so. But with that, you get, like, instead of one agent, you have 10 agents now, right, which do the same marketing posts on your LinkedIn, and some of them are becoming more and more, they are entitled to do things without human sometimes, or they could do much more than, previously we used to have this generation AI things, like we just generate text or whatever, and then we use it as a human. Now, this AI framework could do much more sophisticated stuff, and it uses lots of identities inside. And it's obviously, for a security guy, it's very interesting what AI agent does what, actually, right? So I want to have logs, I want to have understanding of the context, why it was doing it, what agent has put a task to another agent. It's also very interesting, right, to understand the potential issues. And I guess at a certain point, then, when these agents are tapping into some app which you try to add to existing IGA, this is, at this point, it would be great to understand, to know. Actually, I don't fully realize if you have sufficient data in this process to understand what agents actually triggered this action, or it should be done a layer before you guys. It's a complex one.
It's very complex. And honestly, we may not have that context. And we may not have that context because of how they executed, right? And this is honestly what keeps me up at night in terms of, like, general fears, kind of pending walls, whatever you want to look at it, right? Is agents are doing a lot of ridiculously cool things right now. Let's just kind of be honest, right? Between the Claude and OpenAI, Grok, the Crew AI stuff, the OpenClaw stuff, good, bad, or indifferent. The amount of skills and speed at which things are being done right now is just very hard to keep up with. Let's put up. It's crazy.
It's just hard to read, to monitor.
You need to
the
be
news.
unemployed to keep up, right?
But the main crux that keeps me up at night in this whole equation, right, is how do they do it? So you just mentioned identity governance automation, right? Someone's automating something with their certification and attestations. How are they doing it with that agent? Or more appropriately, what representation? What we're finding too often is, hey, they want to do something, but rather than essentially delegating to that agent or defining a proper authorization or access model, they're just giving it credentials. Like, hey, I know I can do something. Well, I'm going to give it my username and password and go have it do these things for me. You look at the Comet browser, the different kind of chat provider browsers that are doing in-screen agents and everything else right now. If they're training these things and giving it their username and password to be able to do it on their, as a automated task for them, instantly that credential is compromised.
And
right?
When I see it, I want to close my eyes, when it's crazy.
No, and the looking at normal user patterns, right? Even if you were to say, like, hey, I'm going to give it a username and password for this application, right? User best practices. 9 out of 10 users, right? They use at least either the same username and or derivative of the same password for every application. And agents are meant to learn patterns and everything else. You do that across a couple of applications, that agent's going to start saying, well, I know the format they're doing this. I'm just going to go start guessing these things. That's the intent of what we're building right now, is this kind of semi-autonomy and learning model, so to speak, right? So you give it one username and password or two, all of a sudden now you just gave it everything. And honestly, that's what keeps me up at night. The other is going to be the accountability problem. If you want to think about it, if we start thinking about the more kind of social or organizational aspects of this, someone downloads an agent and goes out and auto approves their certifications, right? Because They do it every month and it takes them 8 hours to do it. Rather than spending the 8 hours, they just give an agent a task to go do it type thing, right? Well, say there's something embedded in that certification that they just auto-closed, and someone starts questioning them and they say, oh, well, I wrote an agent to do that on my behalf. Are they responsible? Is the agent? Is the compromiser credentials accountable? There's these cases that are starting to crop up.
Into ethical question, like how to, what would you say in the court? Is it you or is it your agent? Sorry, I didn't know that it was doing it, but come on, you wrote that skill MD, which actually executed this stuff, right? So
it's
legal. Responsible?
It's legal questions, basically, right? It's not ethical anymore, because I think it's like something you can discuss in the bar, right? But legal, you're going to be answering in the court.
It's like privacy. Is it legal or is it ethical? I think it both. It's legal and ethical.
I think the ethical breakdown, though, I mean, my wife will make fun of me, and she'll attest to this, right, is my username and password is a representation of me. And I think it's getting too easy to give these out now to execute tasks or in the interest of executing tasks, that it's hard to essentially go back to a person when you semi-delegate, right? Just not delegate the right way. And that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. Listen, it's very exciting, and I would love to tap into even deeper, but we then would transfer our episode from educational into discovery and real science, deep science dive. Listen, Nick, you have a great background. I would say unique. I mean, I do not know too many people who ran multi-million, multi-year programs implementing IGAs across critical infrastructures, I would say. Could you, in a couple of words, just tell us how it feels from inside? How do these programs actually look behind the scenes, and what is being changed across the last 3-4 years, including all the stuff we discussed with StackBob appeared on the market, with Agentic AIs, with non-human identities, and all this stuff.
The biggest thing for me, what I like to tell everyone, the inside of an IGA deployment, it looks crazy complex, right? You've got all these HR sources, you've got all this manipulation of data and everything else you need to do, whether it's generating users, going through your joiner, mover, leaver processes, assigning roles, everything else, right? It looks really complex. And then you've got all this kind of fan out of target applications. What I like to tell everyone is it's actually really simple at the end of the day. It's inputs and outputs. So an IGA program can get very complicated if you let it, right? And by nature, it's going to be very complicated, but you need to break it down into simple inputs and outputs, right? So what are my drivers? What's my incoming data? How am I going to analyze it, right? And then what do I need to connect to? And then start prioritizing from there, right? I came from the camp of I needed to control everything. I needed to make it ultra complex and everything else, right? And at the end of the day, you kind of get stuck in mud because you're trying to overanalyze and kind of overplan and everything else. Just focus on the inputs and outputs, and the implementation will go down the path that needs to happen, right? I mean, there's going to be bumps along the road and you need to kind of plan for everything, but at the end of the day, it's going to happen, right? So from an overall last handful of years, I would say the biggest shift for me has been the cloud governance. So I say the two big drivers for this were Savient and Identity now, which is Identity Security Cloud, SailPoint, right? Before then, identity governance was always an extension of existing HR processes. So I came from the Oracle kind of camp, so to speak, that you could customize and build and do whatever you wanted, right? But in that customization became complexity, and complexity became failure, if you want to think of it that way, right? So we built these ultra complex processes around existing business processes and everything else. But once cloud governance came along, they kind of, to be able to support a very wide range of companies, they started putting guardrails, so to speak, on process flows. Okay, you want to do single manager, maybe 2 manager level approvals, or it has to be a role owner approval. Or from a HR provisioning perspective, here are defined attribute sets we're going to support and everything else. If you need to do extensions, maybe there's some capability, but we started kind of funneling down into this guardrail approach that really told companies you need to do two things: either conform to these guardrails, or two, not go down the cloud governance route, right? And most companies are going down that cloud governance and redoing their business processes. So what we're seeing is you're seeing a lot more continuity across implementations, so to speak, that you don't have those ultra customized. There's a certain level of customization you can do, right, based on businesses and everything else. But we're seeing a lot more, I'd say, simplicity, upgradability, continuity from an implementation perspective, which has helped a lot, right? I got a moniker or an aura around me, whatever you want to call it, right? That I used to go in and fix these like ultra complex Oracle installs, right? Because I like to decode stuff. I like to break it apart, right? Those days are kind of going away because most of the cloud governance have defined processes for a lot of this stuff.
But at the same time,
which is helping from a stability.
The processes, how quickly the processes inside even large and fairly conservative organization could change. In 2026, it's quite quick, right? So yesterday you could have a sub-department which doesn't exist today, but instead a new one appeared with absolutely new processes. And I see companies, they try to kind of, pressure this type of quick changes more and more, and trying to promote it and trying to, thinking that this flexibility brings more competitive advantages, etc. So in this reality, the old approaches, I think they're simpler and, they're not working because you don't have time to build this diligent processes of RBAC and all this stuff. Yeah.
15 years ago when I was doing Oracle, if you need to spin up a whole new department and a bunch of stuff around it, that was a 3-6 month project, right? Now with Identity Security Cloud,
in one day.
Yeah, it's within a couple of days. You can have a full RBAC model and users being provisioned to that, with updated data from HR and everything else. The really cool stuff is you look at the Savvy acquisition by SailPoint recently, or some of the rapid application onboarding by Savient, right? They're starting to essentially delegate the application onboarding to those new departments and groups. Say you do spin up a new sales group and they bring their own applications with them. They can go in and request them to be onboarded into that governance platform and map to the existing identity model. Now, this is where StackBob comes into play, right? Is what does that application onboarding look like if they're bringing in I make this joke a lot, and I apologize if this application's out there, but I always say Joe Bob's Marketing, right? If there's a Joe Bob's Marketing out there, I apologize. I use your name a lot, but they're bringing in, let's say, Joe Bob's Marketing. It doesn't have SCIM. It doesn't have, modern APIs and everything else, right? They're doing essentially a manual fulfillment task versus if they bring in Joe Bob's Marketing, it'll reach out to StackBob at that point and start the onboarding process, right? Some of these deeper integrations we're building with StackBob, that it can go out and learn the user functionality, right? Once we've been invited to that application. So as a marketing group requests the onboarding, it's onboarding a native application in that target IGA platform.
Yeah. Amazing, Nick. I sit then right over there saying that, guys, you don't have any more time. Mm-hmm. So let's think about one final question.
I think let's do two.
Okay, let's do two.
Too personal. So I know that there was a time in your professional career where you almost got to the point where it made no sense to continue working in the industry. Can you share this moment with us a bit?
The traditional cybersecurity or helming stuff, yeah?
No, it was really an eye-opening experience for me, and 100% true. I'd say I was probably early 30s at the time. It's been just short of 15 years at that point, right? But yeah, I got to a point where I felt I wasn't achieving anything, right? And I really had a different mindset then. And I think this is kind of a functional shift that I made personally, right? We're making it as an industry at this point. But prior to that, I was very control heavy. Okay, I am the security guy. I need to funnel everything through me. I need to own it. I need to control it. Security, us being protectors by nature, we want to kind of put our arms around things and control it and make sure it's 100% the way we need to do it type thing, right? And what I was running up against is just kind of, I was trying to dig the ocean out with a spoon, so to speak, right? The business was moving faster than I could keep my arms around it. And I got burnt out, to be honest, right? I was having health issues and a bunch of other things and just got burnt out, right? And one thing clicked in my head. One, I need to fix my health, right? So I went out and I'm heavily into fitness. Anyone that knows me, you watch my LinkedIn, I'm constantly posting lifting videos and everything else, right? Love lifting. I'm a big meathead. I call myself the meathead nerd, right? So fitness was one thing that gave me an outlet at that point in time. The other thing that really kind of caught on in my head is I need to focus on the service of security and identity, not so much controlling identity and security. So one of the bigger things I talk to a lot of CISOs about is from an identity program perspective, and we talked about it at the beginning, the access management, identity governance, even the savvy and self-service, right? Is you need to build processes, patterns, tools that the users can build this stuff themselves or at least request it to integrate into your environment. So from an identity governance, access management, everything else perspective, my goal is to make it easy so it can integrate so that people can do it themselves, but still conform to the enterprise standards. So this kind of service approach has really kind of opened my eyes the last 15 years, so to speak, to say, you know what, I'm not going to focus so much on the control. I'm going to build the patterns, but I'm going to build the interfaces that people can integrate what they're building into that, not try to be overly controlling. And honestly, it's been a huge mental weight off of me since then. And I love my job. I love helping people. So it's it's one of those things that once I realized I couldn't control it, I focused on my health, my mind, and kind of focused on the service side of it. It's been great.
And now with StackBob, what's your vision of the future of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, my vision of the industry from the future perspective is to accelerate identity governance, right? It's always been a thorn in most CISOs I talk to. I was at a SANS conference this week and I was talking to someone and we were talking about identity governance and we're like, oh yeah, certifications are definitely a pain point for us between the spreadsheets and trying to get data into identity governance and everything else. It's just one of those things that no one likes, right? And I'm like, what if I said,
True.
What if I could make it easier for you? And I kind of told him what we're doing. He's like, yeah, here's my identity guy. You need to talk to him right now to make this easier, right? So my vision of identity, from an identity governance perspective, is make it easier, right? Fix that connectivity problem so identity governance has all the data it needs so it can actually act on what it needs to do, right? We were talking a little bit about what keeps me up at night. All the AI features that are going into identity governance platforms right now, right? Around the role recommenders, the automated approvals, dynamic certifications, attestations, everything else, right? What are they making those decisions on today if they only have 20% of the visibility, right?
Yeah.
So where's that next gap, that next kind of thing that's going to happen, based on those recommendations on a limited set of data? So my vision is I want 95% of that data in there so we can actually leverage this and start making actionable, very fast responses.
Cool. Amazing. Brilliant talk. I wish all the best to I wasn't afraid of this word, to the disruptive StackBob approach in closing the enormously huge gap of not covering 70% of applications and finally enabling the true, reliable attestation processes in the companies.
Amen.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you
for having me on today.
Very interesting.
Cheers.
Good luck.
Thanks. Virtual high five going?
High five. Yeah. Boom. Yay. We need to think on how we should synchronize this clapping.
Let's try again.
Let's try again.
Just you're in counting on 1, 3.
3.
It's even better.
Nice.